Ah yes, X-Men video games. In the past on here we have looked at a number of decent ones, including the X-Men arcade game, Children of the Atom, Mutant Apocalypse, and even the unbelievable for its time, X-Men vs Street Fighter. One particular feature that all of these titles share is that they were developed and published by respectable video game companies from Japan. Konami and Capcom's pedigree over the period would result in some amazing Marvel superhero based games, but in the realm of home consoles for a while, Marvel games were often far from spectacular. For a great while, Acclaim would hold exclusive publishing rights for all Marvel games on home consoles. So before the now Capcom classics were making it into our living rooms, we retreated to some less favourable X-Men games. In today's video we are going to take a trip back to 1994 to look at some of these, covering a pair of games that would each include the iconic Wolverine as their titular stars. While these titles have certainly not managed to go down in history as must-play experiences, one version houses an attribute that was so incredibly ahead of its time that I felt it needed to be revisited to believe. So, holding such a thought in mind, hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. This is Wolverine Adamantium Rage, a game that invented something without knowing it. Yeah. While most famous for being a member of the X-Men, what may surprise many is that the popular character, known as Wolverine, never originated from an X-Men comic, but instead an issue of The Incredible Hulk. After this initial appearance within issue 180, published back in 1974, Wolverine would later join a revamped version of the superhero team, known as the X-Men, leading to the character becoming more well known than ever before. He would even have a memorable catchphrase established: "I'm the best there is at what I do, but what I do best isn't very nice." The direction for Wolverine's character mirrored many anti-heroes who were gaining in popularity after the conclusion of the Vietnam War. Wolverine and others marked change from heroes of old, as his loner nature and willingness to use deadly force made him edgier than most of his predecessors. Noticing how beloved Wolverine had become by 1982, the anti-hero would be given his own solo 4-issue limited series, which would lean into his loner nature further, and by 1988, a regular ongoing series would also be started. Moving into 1992, Wolverine would begin to gain even more traction and exposure, featuring as one of the key characters within the Fox Children's Network's X-Men animated show, a format that would prove to be so enjoyed that it would spawn 76 episodes across 5 seasons, with Disney even planning to continue the series very shortly. So Wolverine was existing as an adored character, both within the X-Men and within his own standalone comic book, which in turn would mean that it was only a matter of time before he became the star of his very own video games. As mentioned earlier, through this period, Acclaim would hold licensing rights to include Marvel characters within their home console games, so they would of course be the company who was set out to cash in on the popularity of the Wolverine brand within the world of video games. In a rather interesting twist, 1994 would see the company publish 2 Wolverine games that would each carry the title Wolverine Adamantium Rage. While both carrying the same name featuring some similarities, these were 2 completely separate games developed by completely different teams, with one game being developed for the Sega Megadrive and the other being created for the Super Nintendo. For the Megadrive version of the game, Acclaim would contract Teeny Weeny Games to carry out development duties. This was a British company headquartered in London, England, and prior to their Wolverine effort, the company had almost exclusive experience developing 8-bit games for the Sega Master System, Game Gear and Nintendo Game Boy. 1994 would see them develop 2 Megadrive games, Wolverine as mentioned, and Fido Dido, a game featuring, you know, the old tubular 7-Up mascot, which ultimately was cancelled. The Super Nintendo version on the other hand would be published under Acclaim's LJN license and be developed by Bit Studios, another British development house. These lot had already developed a number of Marvel games in the past, including The Amazing Spider-Man 2 for Game Boy, Spider-Man vs Kingpin for Game Gear, The Return of the Sinister Six and Spider-Man 3 Invasion of the Spider Slayers. Wolverine Adamantium Rage, though, did mark the first and last ever Marvel Nintendo game that the team would work on. For a side fact, amusingly, this team were also tasked with making the cancelled Super Nintendo version of Fido Dido, so there are quite a few similarities between these two groups of British developers. Across some areas at least, praise can be showered on both of these 16-bit efforts. For example, visually they both look great and feature some cool storytelling. Powering on the Megadrive game introduces us to a sensational sounding original soundtrack, and a great opening shot of Wolverine protracting his claws before the title menu is revealed. The file selection at the bottom of the screen even gives us some great little character bios, with Wolverine's one for example telling us about his adamantium claws, mutant healing abilities and skeleton laced with unbreakable metal. Here we are also introduced to some of the game's other cast members, such as Albert, a deadly android replica of Wolverine who has been designed to destroy him, Bloodscream, a vampire who is one of Wolverine's oldest foes, Cyber, another adamantium claw-wielding enemy, Fitzroy, who can drain life force from individuals, The Hand, a group of deadly ninjas, LCD, an android with an appearance of a young girl who is also built with the sole purpose of destroying Wolverine, Lurker, a further ally of the androids, Sabretooth, who shares many of Wolverine's abilities, Shinobi Shaw, a merciless individual who can pass through solid objects, and Lady Deathstrike, a highly trained warrior who desires to kill Wolverine so strongly that she has subjected herself to dreadful experiments, turning herself into a killing machine. This whistle-stop tour is perfect for those who want to understand the characters and their motivations within the game as quickly as possible without the need to sift through piles of comic books. The beginning of the game's story is told through an animated scene that shows Wolverine being experimented on, with adamantium being added to his bones for the first time. He does however successfully break free of his confines, which leads to the start of the gameplay itself. Like much of the storytelling in this one, the gameplay itself looks great, with backgrounds appearing vivid, sprites being large and Wolverine looking as recognisable and iconic as ever. Pair all of this with decent music throughout, on the surface this would appear a good game that would have been incredibly easy to market, essentially making it no different from many titles that were published by LJN. Sadly though, beyond the aesthetics, pretty much everything else in this one falls apart, with the game simply not being fun to play. This is essentially down to a few core reasons, most notably the title's unresponsive controls and at points dreadful hit detection. I will say though, I do like that Wolverine slowly regains health as he walks around, as this mechanic is the perfect nod to the character's famous healing abilities. Gameplay at its heart plays like a beat-em-up platformer, just an incredibly bad one. Controls are slippery, and as you throw your claws at opponents it often feels like chaos, due to the title's awful hit detection and horrible fighting mechanics. While the game has certainly not aged at all well, it was criticised heavily on initial release too. GamePro hated the title's generic design, lack of excitement, and most especially the controls of course, which they said was so poor that even clearing the first level can feel almost impossible. In their conclusion regarding this one, they wrote, "When the highlights of the game are its mediocre graphics and sounds, that should trigger an immediate red flag." Electronic Gaming Monthly would cover the game as well, awarding it just 4.25 out of 10, with their most heavy criticism targeting the game's controls. Next Generation gave the game 2 out of 5 stars, with their panning of the game being a tad more unfair to me, as they concluded Wolverine is a decent platform brawler, but in the end it's just another platform brawler, and around here that's only good for 2. I mean, fair enough, I would review this game pretty low too, but to call it a decent platform brawler, then to score it low as you think the genre itself is bad, that sounds like some poor journalism. But then again, what do I know, I'm just a stupid YouTuber. So anyway, that's the Mega Drive side of things covered. Let's move on to the Super Nintendo. Straight away you will notice some similarities between the two games. For example, character bio files have been included once again. Both of these acclaimed games had Mark Flitman at the producer helm, so one assumes both development teams were working from the same briefs. The story is told in this one through comic book style scenes, with the first of these showing Wolverine being contacted by an unknown party claiming they have info on his past. This results in Wolverine travelling from location to location trying to learn more, which is the character's reason for progressing from stage to stage. Much of what I praised about the Megadrive game can equally be praised here. The music throughout is great, the game is graphically impressive looking, and the large character sprite that represents Wolverine does the character justice. But once again, it is the gameplay where things just fall apart. While I would state that the Super Nintendo game is slightly more responsive than what can be found on the Mega Drive, the title's convoluted control scheme makes the title feel like a chore to play, and nothing you can make Wolverine do ever feels actually intuitive. Gameplay is also different in this one in that Wolverine must travel around the stage slashing down a set number of bad guys. The problem is though that some enemies that spawn do not count as ones you have to defeat, and some you do have to defeat respawn after you leave the area, so tracking down the ones you need to take out can feel convoluted and confusing. Once again, at points you have to swing your claws around like a mad person to make progress, and often it feels like you are slashing through enemies rather than making any impact, as the game's hit detection can feel diabolical at points. This version also involves a fair amount of wall climbing, which, while a nice touch, just like every other manoeuvre in the game, isn't at all intuitive, so pulling this off can feel annoying. Not much about either version of this game particularly excite me, and just as a claim planned, the only reason I had any interest in checking them out was that they starred Wolverine.
And that won't ever happen again.
This Wolverine game wasn't as panned on release as its Mega Drive counterpart, but no one was claiming it was any future classic either. Electronic Gaming Monthly gave the SNES version 6.2 out of 10, commenting that Wolverine has plenty of moves and lots of techniques, and fans of a comic character will definitely want to check this one out, but in the end it's routine action. GamePro raved that sharp graphics, non-stop action and intense challenges make this game a formidable opponent for any super gamers. Which to me is code for please Acclaim, keep sending us review copies of all of your games. The controls are rubbish which makes the game difficult to play, so we'll tell our readers they simply need to get good. Next Generation looked at this one too, stating that you could get just as much Adamantium Rage from an old copy of Impossible Mission. If you're a Wolverine fan, go for Capcom's SNES X-Men, which, to be fair, is an incredibly sensible suggestion from a 90s game journo. If it were not for the fact that both of these games star Wolverine, they would likely have been almost completely forgotten to time by now, with both titles functioning as your typical Acclaim affairs, of examples of games that were rushed out to hit a publishing date, with them of perhaps benefiting if they had been allowed a little more time in the oven. Still, with these games are as unremarkable as I have suggested, how could one of them have possibly invented something completely new that is incredibly impressive all these years on? Well, this brings us to the last portion of this video, discussing the music that can be found within the Super Nintendo version of the game. Back in 2016, the internet would come alive with discussions and news articles that had noticed that some of the music in the game appeared to be grime music, despite the fact that the game had been developed an incredible 8 years before the genre had been thought to have been invented. Like the development of these Wolverine games, grime music was developed in London. This style of music is said to have initially been spread through pirate radio stations and spread around the underground scene, with by the mid-2000s, grime artists becoming huge household names in the UK, such as Dizzy Rascal, Kano, Lethal Bizzle and Wiley. I bet you never expected to hear me mention these lot in a retro gaming video. Grime would end up becoming the most significant development in the UK music industry for decades, so was grime really in a 1994 Super Nintendo game? Years earlier? Let's have a listen so you can decide. In 2002, Youngstar's Pulse X would be released, a track that is often considered to have been the first grime beat. But as you can hear, there are a lot of similarities in style, despite the fact that this game came out long before. So what on earth is going on here that makes this music sound like grime? Were the likes of Dizzy Rascal and Lethal Bizzle just Wolverine superfans, or was there something else going on? Let's discuss. To answer this question, we need to look to the man behind the music from the Super Nintendo version of the game, a man called Dylan Bill. Bill would be hired to create music for the game and would later be interviewed by SBTV explaining the story behind the sounds of the game. At the time, Bill worked in a wood green based record shop which sold mainly techno and reggae, but was also part of a jungle duo known as Rude and Deadly. While jungle was indeed massive, which was wicked, Bill was also a huge fan of West Coast hip hop. He would use his opportunity working on the Wolverine game to compose mostly West Coast hip hop inspired sounds, but the Grime sounding music on the other hand was created almost by accident due to limitations of the Super Nintendo cartridge's limited storage capacity. Retrospectively to SBTV, Bill stated, "When we were making drum and bass tunes, we had 2 or 3 megabytes to work with, but the video game company Acclaim only gave us 200 kilobytes. I mean, I've sent emails that are bigger than that. It's a mind-bogglingly small amount of space considering I had to do all the voice samples, all the sound effects, and all the tunes. I basically sampled an orchestral stab, the bass, a hi-hat, snare, a few things like that. Then I had to trim them down to minute sizes. I used a program called Sample Vision, which meant I could get them down to tiny sizes and then reduce the quality right down, which gives it that really dirty, horrible sound. Back then, everybody was after quality and polishing up the sound, but now everyone wants to go back to that really dirty digital sound. As for the grime sounding boss themes in these games, it is of note that Bill, like many of the early grime artists themselves, was part of a London scene that was heavily influenced by reggae, hip hop, jungle, techno and hardcore. So all the ingredients were present for Bill to come up with similar sounds to what would become mainstream years on. In a hilarious twist, grime artists have since sampled the track, and one YouTube user has mixed it with Temper T's Next Hype, resulting in perfect results. I'll link it as a pinned comment so you can say Top Hack Gaming Man sent me here. Bill himself had his ears exposed to this marvellousness, with him commenting, "I listened to this earlier and nearly fell off my chair laughing. It's so f***ing good. I need this in my life, it's absolutely brilliant." If you look at the comments on the YouTube videos of the Adamantium Rage soundtrack, then some of them are hilarious. People saying it's the greatest music they've ever heard, and the soundtrack to their childhood. So there you have it. Wolverine Adamantium Rage was the first place where we could ever hear grime music. The musical style, which would become popular on the BBC, first popped up in a Super Nintendo game years before. What a fun little story, indeed. Anyway, if you enjoyed this one, why not check out my upload on Capcom's X-Men Mutant Apocalypse. Yeah, cheerio.